The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Windsor as 8-year-old Emma Matthews pressed her small face against the cool glass window of her grandmother's cottage. Her breath fogged the pain as she watched the early preparations for what would become the most important day of her young life, though she didn't know it yet. Emma lived with her grandmother, Margaret, in a tiny house that sat just 50 yards from the main parade route where the Queen's annual procession would pass in just 3 hours. For weeks, the entire town had buzzed with excitement about the royal visit, but Emma felt different about it than everyone else. While other children chattered about catching glimpses of the crown jewels and the magnificent horses, Emma had been quietly working on something far more personal. Margaret Matthews was a woman of 73 with silver hair that she kept in a neat bun and hands that never stopped moving. She had raised Emma since the little girl was 4 years old, after Emma's parents died in a car accident on a rainy Tuesday evening. The loss had left Emma with a selective muteness that worried doctors and teachers alike. She could speak perfectly well when she felt safe, but, in crowds or stressful situations, words simply wouldn't come. The cottage where they lived had been in Margaret's family for 4 generations. It was small but warm, with a kitchen that always smelled of fresh bread and a sitting room filled with photographs of family members who had passed on. Emma's favorite spot was the window seat in the front room, where she could watch the world go by while working on her various projects. For the past month, Emma had been secretly learning something that no one else knew about. She had discovered a book in the local library about sign language, and, with the determination that only an 8-year-old could muster, she had been teaching herself the basics. Every day after school, while Margaret thought she was doing homework, Emma was actually practicing hand movements in front of the small mirror in her bedroom. The idea had come to her after watching a television program about deaf children who used their hands to communicate. Emma realized that maybe she could find a way to speak even when her voice failed her. She had been practicing for weeks, slowly building up a vocabulary of simple words and phrases. She kept a notebook hidden under her mattress where she drew pictures of the hand positions and wrote down what each sign meant. On this particular morning, as the royal preparations continued outside, Emma pulled out her secret notebook and reviewed the signs she had been practicing. She had learned how to sign hello, please, thank you, and dozens of other words. But there was one special message she had been working on, something she hoped to somehow share with the Queen if the opportunity arose. Margaret bustled around the kitchen, preparing sandwiches and tea for their royal viewing party. She had invited several neighbors to watch the parade from their front garden, and the house was filled with the sounds of preparation. Emma helped where she could, setting out cups and folding napkins, but her mind kept wandering to the notebook hidden upstairs. The story of Emma's parents was one that Margaret tried to handle with care. David and Sarah Matthews had been driving home from an anniversary dinner when their car skidded on wet leaves and struck a tree. Emma, who had been staying with Margaret that night, woke up the next morning to find her world completely changed. The trauma had affected her ability to speak in public, though she remained chatty and animated when alone with Margaret. Over the years, Margaret had tried various approaches to help Emma overcome her selective muteness. They had visited speech therapists, child psychologists, and even tried drama classes to build Emma's confidence. While Emma made progress in safe environments, large crowds or formal situations still rendered her speechless. Margaret worried constantly about how this would affect Emma's future, especially as she grew older and needed to navigate school presentations and social situations. The royal visit had been announced 3 months earlier, and the entire community of Windsor had thrown itself into preparations. Streets were cleaned until they sparkled, buildings were painted, and every garden was manicured to perfection. The Queen's route would take her past dozens of local landmarks, including the small cottage where Emma and Margaret lived. For Emma, the announcement had sparked an idea that grew stronger each day. She began to imagine what it would be like to somehow communicate directly with the Queen, to share something personal and meaningful without having to rely on her unreliable voice. This was when she discovered the sign language book at the library and began her secret mission to learn this new form of communication. The library where Emma made her discovery was a small, cozy building with high ceilings and tall windows that let in streams of dusty sunlight. Mrs. Henderson, the librarian, had noticed Emma spending unusual amounts of time in the reference section but hadn't questioned the serious little girl who always returned books on time and treated them with obvious respect. Emma's notebook had grown thick with her careful drawings and notes. She had learned that sign language wasn't just moving your hands randomly, but was a complete language with grammar and structure. She practiced finger spelling, where each letter of the alphabet had its own hand position, and she learned whole word signs that conveyed meaning more quickly. The message she hoped to share with the Queen was simple but deeply meaningful to her. She had been practicing it every night before bed, moving her small hands through the careful sequence of signs. It was a message of gratitude, not just for the Queen's service, but for something more personal that Emma felt in her heart. As the morning progressed, the sounds from the street grew louder. Workers were setting up barriers along the parade route, and early arrivals were beginning to claim their viewing spots. Emma could see children with small flags and adults with cameras, all chattering excitedly about the upcoming procession. Margaret had prepared their own viewing area in the small front garden, setting up chairs and a small table with refreshments. Their neighbors, the Johnsons from next door and Mrs. Pettigrew from across the street, would join them soon. Emma liked these familiar people, and, around them, her voice worked normally. But she knew that once the crowds arrived and the excitement built, speaking would become difficult if not impossible. The cottage itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Margaret had polished every surface until it gleamed, and she had even hung a small Union Jack from the front window. Emma had helped by drawing pictures of the Queen to decorate their viewing area, though she hadn't told Margaret about the special message she hoped to deliver. Emma's artistic abilities had always impressed the adults in her life. Despite her difficulties with verbal communication, she had a gift for expressing herself through drawings and written words. Her bedroom walls were covered with sketches of animals, flowers, and people from her daily life. Margaret often said that Emma saw the world differently than other children, noticing details that others missed. The preparation for the royal visit had brought out something special in the entire community. Neighbors who rarely spoke to each other were collaborating on decorations. Local businesses had created special displays in their windows. Even the normally grumpy Mr. Pembridge, who lived at the end of their street, had hung bunting from his fence. For Emma, watching these preparations had reinforced her desire to contribute something meaningful to the day. She didn't just want to be another face in the crowd, waving a flag and hoping for a royal glance. She wanted to offer something personal, something that came from her heart rather than from a store-bought souvenir shop. The sign language book that had started her journey was titled Hands That Speak and was written by a deaf teacher who wanted to help hearing people understand the beauty of visual communication. Emma had been drawn to the photographs of children using sign language, their faces bright with expression as their hands moved gracefully through the air. As she learned more about sign language, Emma discovered that it wasn't just for deaf people. Many hearing individuals learned signing to communicate with deaf family members or friends. Some people found it useful in noisy environments where spoken words couldn't be heard. Emma began to see it as a universal language that could bridge gaps between people who might otherwise struggle to connect. The message she had chosen for the Queen had taken weeks to perfect. She had started with simple greetings, but gradually realized she wanted to share something more meaningful. The final message she settled on was one that expressed her gratitude not just for the Queen's presence, but for the hope and stability that the royal family represented to people like Emma who had experienced loss and uncertainty. Margaret called from the kitchen, asking Emma to help carry the tea service to the garden table. As Emma carefully transported the delicate cups and saucers, she thought about how her grandmother had created such a stable, loving home for her after her world had been shattered. Margaret never made Emma feel like a burden or treated her differently because of her selective muteness. Instead, she had simply adjusted their life to accommodate Emma's needs while gently encouraging her to push beyond her comfort zone. The neighbors began arriving shortly before 10 o'clock, each bringing their own chairs and contributions to the viewing party. Mrs. Johnson brought homemade biscuits, while Mrs. Pettigrew carried a thermos of hot chocolate for Emma. Mr. Johnson had brought his expensive camera and immediately began testing different angles for photographs. Emma watched the adults settle into their chairs and begin chattering about previous royal visits, memorable moments from past parades, and speculation about what they might see today. She noticed how easily they talked with each other, how words flowed naturally from their mouths without any apparent effort. Sometimes she envied this ease of communication, but today she felt proud of the alternative method she had been secretly developing. The crowd along the parade route was growing steadily larger. Families with young children were claiming spots near the barriers, spreading blankets on the ground and unpacking elaborate picnic lunches. Teenagers were taking selfies with the royal decorations in the background. Elderly couples were setting up folding chairs and adjusting their positions for the best possible view. Emma could feel the familiar tightness in her chest that came when she was surrounded by too many people and too much noise. Her voice was already beginning to feel distant and unreachable. But, instead of feeling frustrated or scared, she felt excited. Today, she had an alternative. Today, she had her hands and the secret language she had been learning. The royal procession was still over an hour away, but Emma could already hear the distant sounds of preparation. Military bands were practicing their music, horses were being prepared in their ceremonial gear, and security personnel were making final checks of the route. The entire town seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the moment when their quiet street would become the center of royal attention. Emma retreated to her favorite window seat inside the cottage, where she could observe the growing crowd while remaining in her comfort zone. She pulled out her notebook one more time, reviewing the signs she would need for her special message. Her small fingers moved through the motions silently, practicing the careful choreography she had memorized. Margaret appeared beside her with a cup of warm milk and a gentle smile. She had long ago learned to recognize when Emma needed a quiet moment to prepare herself for challenging situations. Without saying anything, she simply sat beside her granddaughter and provided the calm, steady presence that Emma relied on. The morning sun was climbing higher in the sky, and the excitement in the air was almost tangible. Emma could see more people arriving every minute, filling every available viewing space along the route. Children were getting restless, adults were checking their watches, and everyone seemed to be buzzing with anticipation. But Emma felt different than the rest of the crowd. While they were waiting to receive something from the royal visit, Emma was preparing to give something back. Her secret message, practiced hundreds of times in the privacy of her bedroom, represented months of dedication and hope. Whether or not the Queen would understand sign language, Emma felt proud that she had found a way to express herself that didn't depend on her unreliable voice. As the morning wore on and the crowd continued to grow, Emma began to feel the familiar mix of excitement and anxiety that came with big events. But underneath these feelings was something new, confidence. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a voice that couldn't be silenced by fear or overwhelm. Her hands would speak even when her vocal cords failed her. The royal visit was about to begin, and Emma was ready. The distant sound of bagpipes drifted through the morning air as Emma joined her grandmother and their neighbors in the small front garden. The royal procession was still 30 minutes away, but the atmosphere along the parade route had transformed into something magical. Hundreds of people lined the streets, their faces bright with anticipation, their hands clutching small Union Jack flags that fluttered in the gentle breeze. Emma positioned herself at the front of their little viewing area, her notebook tucked safely in the pocket of her best dress. Margaret had chosen the outfit carefully that morning, a navy blue dress with white collar and cuffs that made Emma look both proper and approachable. Her hair was brushed until it shone and held back with a white ribbon that matched her dress. Mrs. Johnson leaned over to Margaret and whispered, "Emma looks absolutely lovely today. She seems excited about the parade." Margaret nodded proudly, though she noticed the telltale signs that Emma was already feeling overwhelmed by the crowd. The little girl's shoulders were slightly hunched, and she was fidgeting with the edge of her pocket where her notebook was hidden. The neighbors chatted easily among themselves, sharing stories of previous royal visits and speculating about which members of the royal family might be in attendance today. Emma listened to their conversations while watching the crowd grow thicker along the barriers. She could see other children about her age, some perched on their fathers' shoulders, others sitting on blankets with elaborate picnic spreads around them. A group of schoolchildren from the local primary school had claimed a spot directly across the street from Emma's cottage. They were all wearing matching t-shirts with the royal coat of arms and carrying handmade signs with messages of welcome. Their teacher was trying to keep them organized, but their excitement was bubbling over in the form of giggles, whispers, and constant movement. Emma found herself studying the other children, wondering if any of them ever struggled to find words when they needed them most. From her position, they all seemed so confident and carefree, ready to shout greetings and wave their flags when the royal car appeared. She felt a familiar pang of envy mixed with determination. today would be different. Today she had prepared something special. The security preparations were becoming more evident as the parade time approached. Police officers appeared at regular intervals along the route, speaking into small radios and scanning the crowd with practiced eyes. Emma watched them with fascination, noting how they seemed to communicate with each other through subtle gestures and nods. It reminded her of the visual communication she had been learning, though much less formal. Margaret offered Emma a small flag to wave during the parade, but Emma politely declined. She wanted her hands free for something more important. Margaret didn't press the issue, having learned over the years to respect Emma's quiet but firm decisions about how she wanted to participate in events. The cottage behind them seemed almost empty now compared to the bustling street. Emma glanced back at the familiar windows and door, thinking about all the hours she had spent practicing her signs in the privacy of her bedroom. The contrast between her quiet preparation and the public excitement of the parade felt significant somehow. She had been getting ready for this moment in her own way, just as surely as the town had been decorating streets and preparing viewing areas. A slight commotion near the barriers caught Emma's attention. A little boy about 5 years old had dropped his flag and was crying because he couldn't reach it through the forest of adult legs around him. Emma watched as several adults tried to help, but they couldn't quite understand what the boy was pointing at. Without thinking, Emma stood up and walked over to the barrier. The crying boy was pointing frantically at something on the ground, but his words were lost in the noise of the crowd. Emma knelt down to his level and looked where he was pointing. She could see the small flag that had fallen between people's feet, well out of reach for someone his size. Emma caught the attention of a nearby adult and pointed to the flag, then gestured to the little boy. The adult understood immediately and retrieved the flag, handing it back to the relieved child. The boy's mother, who had been frantically searching for her son, appeared just as he received his flag back. "Thank you so much," she said to Emma. "You're very kind to help him." Emma smiled and nodded, feeling proud that she had been able to help even without using words. It was a small preview of how communication could work beyond just speaking. As Emma returned to her spot, she noticed that Margaret had been watching the interaction with a thoughtful expression. Her grandmother had always encouraged Emma's natural kindness and her ability to notice when others needed help. It was one of Emma's special gifts. She paid attention to details and emotions that many people missed. The sound of military bands was getting closer now, and ripples of excitement were moving through the crowd like waves. People were standing up straighter, adjusting their cameras, and checking their watches. Children were being lifted onto shoulders for better views. Emma could feel her heart beating faster as the moment approached. Mrs. Pettigrew pulled out a small pair of opera glasses and began scanning the distance for signs of the royal procession. "I think I can see some movement at the far end of the route," she announced excitedly. Everyone in their little group craned their necks to look in the direction she was pointing. Emma's notebook felt warm in her pocket where her nervous hand kept checking to make sure it was still there. She had memorized her message so thoroughly that she probably didn't need the notebook anymore, but having it there gave her confidence. It represented weeks of secret work and dedication, her own personal preparation for this moment. The crowd's energy was becoming infectious. Even Emma, who usually felt overwhelmed by large gatherings, found herself caught up in the anticipation. There was something special about hundreds of people all focused on the same hopeful expectation. Everyone was waiting for the same magical moment when ordinary Tuesday morning would be transformed by royal presence. A vendor with a cart full of small flags and royal souvenirs made his way along the edge of the crowd, calling out his wares in a cheerful voice. Several families made purchases, adding to their collection of memorabilia from the day. Emma watched the transactions with interest, noting how excited people were to have something tangible to remember the occasion. But Emma's preparation was different. Instead of buying something to commemorate the day, she had created something to contribute to it. Her weeks of practice with sign language represented her own unique way of participating in the royal visit. She wasn't just hoping to receive a memory, she was planning to offer something meaningful from her heart. The security presence was increasing as the parade time approached. Emma noticed more police officers positioned along the route, and she could see official-looking cars parked at intervals along the street. The preparation was impressive and somewhat intimidating, but it also made the approaching event feel more real and significant. Margaret leaned over to Emma and pointed to a group of children across the street who were practicing their waves and cheers. "Look how excited they are," she said softly. "I remember feeling the same way when I was young and the Queen visited our town for the first time." Emma nodded, appreciating her grandmother's attempt to connect this moment with family history. The story Margaret was referring to had happened 50 years earlier, when she was just about Emma's age. Her own grandmother had taken her to see Queen Elizabeth during one of her early royal tours, and Margaret had never forgotten the feeling of being part of something larger than herself. She hoped Emma would have a similar experience today, adapted to her own unique way of being in the world. Emma began to notice individual faces in the crowd around them. There was an elderly gentleman with a military bearing who stood very straight and held a small flag with obvious pride. Near him, a young mother was trying to keep her twin toddlers entertained while they waited. Behind them, a group of teenagers was taking selfies and laughing together. Each person in the crowd had their own reason for being there, their own connection to this moment. Emma realized that her desire to communicate directly with the Queen, though unusual, was just one of many ways people were hoping to make this day special and personal. Everyone was bringing their own energy and intention to the collective experience. The distant sound of horses' hooves on pavement could now be heard beneath the general noise of the crowd. Emma's pulse quickened as she recognized this as one of the first concrete signs that the royal procession was actually approaching. After weeks of anticipation and preparation, the moment was finally arriving. Margaret noticed Emma's increased alertness and gently placed a reassuring hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. She had learned to provide this kind of quiet support during potentially overwhelming situations. Emma appreciated the contact, it grounded her and helped her stay centered as the excitement around them continued to build. The notebook in Emma's pocket seemed to pulse with importance. Soon, very soon, she would have the opportunity to put all her secret practice into action. She thought through her message one more time, visualizing the sequence of hand movements she had practiced hundreds of times. Her small hands felt ready and capable. A cheer erupted from the crowd about a quarter-mile down the parade route, confirming that the royal procession was now visible to those with the best vantage points. The sound sent a wave of excitement through everyone waiting, like an electric current passing from person to person. Emma felt her breathing become shallow with anticipation. Mrs. Johnson raised her camera and began taking practice shots, checking the light and adjusting her position for the best possible photographs. "I want to make sure I capture every moment," she explained to no one in particular. Emma understood this desire to preserve something special, though her own method would leave no photographic record. The royal cars were still not visible from their position, but the sound of the procession was growing steadily louder. Military bands, horse hooves, and the general noise of a large moving parade combined to create a unique soundtrack that announced the approach of something truly significant. Emma stood up from her chair and moved closer to the barrier that separated their viewing area from the street. Margaret started to caution her about getting too close, but then stopped herself. She could see the determination in Emma's posture and decided to trust her granddaughter's judgment about what she needed to do. The little girl who had spent months secretly preparing for this moment was ready. Her hands were steady, her message was memorized, and her heart was full of hope that she might somehow connect across the formal distance that usually separated ordinary people from royalty. The parade was almost here, and Emma's carefully planned moment of truth was about to arrive. The crowd's excitement reached a new pitch as the first official vehicles came into view. Emma took a deep breath and touched her notebook one final time, then positioned herself where she would have the clearest possible view when the royal car passed by their cottage. Everything she had worked for was about to be put to the test. Part 3 The first motorcycle escorts appeared around the bend in the road, their engines rumbling in perfect formation as they cleared the way for the royal procession. Emma felt her heart leap as she realized this was really happening. After weeks of preparation and dreaming, the moment was finally here. The crowd around her surged forward slightly, everyone straining for the best possible view. Emma positioned herself carefully at the front of their viewing area, her small hands already beginning to move through practice motions as she mentally rehearsed her message one final time. The notebook remained safely in her pocket, but she no longer needed it. Every sign was burned into her memory through countless hours of secret practice in her bedroom mirror. The motorcycle escorts were followed by several official cars carrying what appeared to be security personnel and royal staff members. Emma watched these vehicles pass with growing excitement, knowing that each one brought her closer to the moment she had been preparing for. The crowd was cheering and waving flags, but Emma kept her hands free, waiting for exactly the right moment. Margaret stood beside her granddaughter, noting the unusual intensity of Emma's focus. In all the years she had cared for Emma, she had rarely seen the child so completely concentrated on something happening outside their immediate family circle. There was something different about Emma's preparation for this day, though Margaret couldn't quite identify what it was. Mrs. Johnson was clicking her camera rapidly, capturing every vehicle in the procession. "This is so exciting," she called out to no one in particular. "I can't believe how close we are to the action." Her enthusiasm was shared by everyone in their small group, but Emma's excitement felt different, more purposeful, more directed toward a specific goal rather than general royal enthusiasm. The sound of the crowd was becoming almost overwhelming as more people joined in cheering and calling out greetings to the passing vehicles. Emma felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with large, noisy gatherings, but today it was mixed with determination rather than anxiety. She had something important to do, and she wouldn't let her usual challenges with crowds prevent her from doing it. A group of children across the street began chanting "God Save the Queen" in unison, their young voices carrying clearly over the general noise of the crowd. Emma listened to their confident, synchronized voices and felt a pang of envy mixed with pride. She couldn't join their vocal tribute, but she had prepared her own way to honor the Queen's visit. Then, Emma saw a distinctive car with flags flying from its front corners, moving slowly and deliberately down the parade route. Even from a distance, she could see that this vehicle was different from the others. It moved with more ceremony, and the crowd's reaction intensified dramatically as it approached. This was unmistakably the royal car. Emma's hands began to tremble slightly as she realized her moment was approaching much faster than she had expected. All her practice had been done in the calm quiet of her bedroom, but now she would have to perform her carefully learned message in front of hundreds of people, with noise and excitement swirling around her. She took a deep breath and tried to center herself the way Margaret had taught her during previous challenging situations. The royal car was now close enough that Emma could see figures inside, though the details weren't yet clear. The vehicle moved at a stately pace, slow enough for the occupants to see and acknowledge the enthusiastic crowds lining the route. Emma watched the car's approach with laser focus, calculating exactly when it would be directly in front of their cottage. Margaret noticed Emma's intense concentration and gently touched her granddaughter's arm. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked quietly. Emma nodded without taking her eyes off the approaching car, her small hands now moving nervously at her sides as she continued to mentally rehearse her message. The crowd's cheering reached a crescendo as the royal car drew nearer. People were waving flags frantically, calling out greetings, and trying to catch the attention of the vehicle's occupants. Emma could see adults lifting children onto their shoulders for better views, and cameras flashing from every direction. The energy was infectious and overwhelming at the same time. As the car came within 50 yards of their position, Emma could finally make out the figures inside. There, unmistakably, was the Queen herself, looking elegant and serene despite the chaos of noise and excitement surrounding her vehicle. She was wearing a bright blue coat and hat, and she was looking out at the crowd with the practiced grace that came from decades of royal duties. Emma felt a moment of panic as she realized this was actually happening. The Queen, the real Queen, was about to pass directly in front of her, and Emma was about to attempt something she had only ever practiced in private. Her hands felt suddenly clumsy and uncertain, nothing like the confident instruments she had trained for weeks. But then, Emma remembered why she had started this project in the first place. She thought about all the times her voice had failed her when she needed it most, all the moments when she had ideas and feelings she couldn't express because words wouldn't come. Today was her chance to communicate in a way that didn't depend on her unreliable voice. The royal car was now only 20 yards away, moving slowly enough that Emma could see the Queen clearly through the window. Her Majesty was looking out at the crowd with obvious pleasure, occasionally raising her hand in the subtle royal wave that acknowledged the enthusiastic reception. Emma realized that in just a few seconds, the car would be directly in front of their cottage. This was the moment Emma had been preparing for through weeks of secret practice. She stepped forward to the very edge of their viewing area, her small figure somehow finding space at the barrier despite the press of excited adults around her. Margaret watched with growing curiosity as Emma positioned herself with unusual determination. Emma raised her hands and began to sign. Her movements were careful and deliberate, each gesture flowing into the next with the precision that came from countless hours of practice. She started with a formal greeting, her hands moving through the signs for "Hello, Your Majesty" with as much grace as her 8-year-old coordination could manage. The message continued as the royal car drew directly parallel to their cottage. Emma's hands moved through signs expressing gratitude not just for the Queen's visit to their town, but for the stability and hope that the royal family represented to people who had experienced loss and uncertainty. It was a deeply personal message, crafted over weeks of thought and practice. Emma signed about how the Queen's long service had provided a sense of continuity for people like herself who had lost their parents young. She expressed appreciation for the example of duty and grace that helped children like her believe that difficult circumstances could be overcome with dignity and persistence. Every sign was deliberate and heartfelt. The royal car had slowed even further, almost to a stop, directly in front of Emma's position at the barrier. Through the window, Emma could see that the Queen was looking in her direction. For a moment that felt suspended in time, their eyes met across the formal distance that usually separated monarchs from their subjects. Then, something extraordinary happened. The Queen's expression changed subtly, shifting from polite royal acknowledgement to something more focused and attentive. Her Majesty was not just looking at Emma, she was watching Emma's hands move through their carefully practiced message. The crowd around Emma was still cheering and waving flags, but Emma felt like she was in a bubble of concentration that blocked out everything except her message and the royal attention it was receiving. Her hands continued to move through the signs with increasing confidence as she realized that her communication was actually being received and understood. Margaret watched in amazement as her granddaughter performed what looked like an elaborate and purposeful gesture sequence directed at the royal car. She had never seen Emma move with such focused intention in a public setting, and she began to understand that this moment represented something Emma had been planning and preparing for in secret. The Queen raised her own hand, not in the usual royal wave, but in what appeared to be a response gesture. Emma's heart leaped as she realized that Her Majesty might actually understand sign language. The royal hand moved in what Emma recognized as the sign for "thank you," followed by what might have been "bless you" or "well done." The entire interaction lasted less than 30 seconds, but, for Emma, it felt like the most important half-minute of her entire life. She had successfully communicated something meaningful directly to the Queen, using the alternative language she had taught herself specifically for this moment. Her voice hadn't failed her because she hadn't needed to use it at all. As the royal car began to move forward again, continuing its stately progress down the parade route, Emma felt a rush of accomplishment unlike anything she had ever experienced. She had done it. She had found a way to express herself authentically and meaningfully in a situation where her usual communication challenges would have rendered her invisible. The crowd around Emma continued cheering as the royal car moved on, but several people near her had noticed something unusual had happened. Mrs. Johnson lowered her camera and looked at Emma with surprise. "What was that beautiful thing you were doing with your hands, dear?" she asked. Margaret knelt down beside Emma, her eyes bright with curiosity and pride. "Emma, what was that? It looked like you were talking with your hands?" Emma nodded, suddenly finding that her voice was available again now that the formal pressure of the royal encounter had passed. "I learned sign language, Grandma," Emma said quietly, her words coming easily now that she was back in the safety of her small family group. "I wanted to say something special to the Queen, something that came from my heart instead of just waving a flag like everyone else." The revelation that Emma had secretly learned an entire alternative form of communication, motivated by her desire to participate meaningfully in the royal visit, left Margaret speechless for a moment. She looked at her granddaughter with new understanding of the depth of Emma's inner life and her creative solutions to the challenges she faced. "What did you say to her?" Mrs. Pettigrew asked gently, having overheard Emma's explanation to her grandmother. Emma thought for a moment about how to translate her careful signs into words that others could understand. I thanked her for being steady and reliable for people who have lost things, Emma said simply. I told her that her example helps children like me believe we can be strong even when bad things happen to our families. The adults in their little group exchanged glances of amazement and respect. This 8-year-old child, who struggled to speak in public settings, had found a way to deliver a message of remarkable maturity and thoughtfulness directly to the Queen of England. Emma had transformed what could have been a frustrating experience of being voiceless in a crowd into a moment of profound personal communication. As the rest of the royal procession continued past their cottage, Emma felt different than she had ever felt before. She had proven to herself that communication didn't have to depend on words coming easily or voices working reliably. There were other ways to express what mattered most, and she had just successfully used one of them in the most important moment of her young life. Part 4 The royal procession continued down the street, but something extraordinary was happening behind the scenes that Emma and the crowd couldn't yet see. Inside the lead security vehicle that had passed earlier, Chief Inspector Williams had been monitoring radio communications when he received an unusual message from the royal car. "Control, this is Royal One," came the voice of the Queen's personal protection officer through the radio. "Her Majesty is requesting the procession to pause. She wishes to return to a previous location along the route." Chief Inspector Williams had been coordinating royal security for 15 years, and he had never received such a request during an active parade. Royal schedules were planned down to the minute, and deviations were extremely rare unless there was a security concern. He pressed his radio button to respond. "Royal One, can you confirm the nature of the request? Is there a security issue?" There was a brief pause before the response came back. "Negative on security concerns, Control. Her Majesty observed something during the parade that she wishes to address personally. She's requesting permission to stop and briefly leave the vehicle at the location we just passed, the cottage with the small garden viewing party." Emma was still basking in the glow of her successful communication when Margaret noticed something unusual happening behind them. Several official vehicles that had already passed their cottage were pulling over and stopping. Security personnel were getting out and speaking into radios with expressions of focused concentration. "That's odd," Mrs. Johnson observed, lowering her camera to watch the unusual activity. "I wonder if there's some kind of problem with the parade route." The other neighbors gathered around their viewing area began to notice the commotion as well, pointing and speculating about what might be happening. Emma turned to see what everyone was looking at, and her heart began to race as she realized that the official activity seemed to be centered near their cottage. Police officers were walking back along the parade route, speaking to crowd control barriers and clearing a small area on the street directly in front of Emma's viewing spot. Margaret felt a flutter of concern as she watched the security preparations. "I hope everything is all right," she said to no one in particular. "This seems like a lot of official attention for our little street." Emma clutched her grandmother's hand, suddenly worried that somehow her sign language message had caused a problem. But the security activity didn't look like a response to trouble. Instead, the officers appeared to be making preparations for something planned and deliberate. They were creating a small clear space on the street and positioning themselves in what looked like a protective formation rather than a response to a threat. Then, Emma heard something that made her catch her breath. The distinctive sound of the royal car's engine was getting louder again, but it was coming from the wrong direction. Instead of continuing away from their cottage, the royal car was returning, moving slowly back up the parade route toward their viewing area. The crowd along the street began to buzz with excitement and confusion as they realized something unprecedented was happening. People were standing up straighter, pointing, and asking each other if they were really seeing the royal car coming back. Children were being lifted onto shoulders again, and cameras were being raised for unexpected second opportunities. Chief Inspector Williams had coordinated with his team to create a secure but accessible area directly in front of the Matthews cottage. The decision to grant the Queen's unusual request had required rapid consultation with multiple security levels, but Her Majesty's determination to follow through on whatever had captured her attention during the initial parade pass had been unmistakable. The royal car came to a complete stop directly in front of Emma's viewing area, in almost exactly the same position where it had been when Emma delivered her sign language message. The crowd fell into an expectant hush, sensing that they were about to witness something special and unplanned. Emma watched in amazement as the door of the royal car opened and Her Majesty the Queen stepped out onto the street. This was beyond anything she had imagined possible when she was planning her secret message. The Queen was actually here, in person, standing just a few feet away from Emma's cottage garden. The Queen was smaller in person than Emma had expected, but her presence seemed to fill the entire space around them. She wore her bright blue coat and matching hat with the elegant bearing that came from decades of public appearances, but there was something different about her demeanor now. She looked focused and purposeful, as if she had a specific mission to accomplish. Security officers formed a discreet protective circle around the Queen, but they maintained enough distance to allow for personal interaction. Emma could see that Her Majesty was looking directly at their little viewing group, her eyes scanning the faces until they settled on Emma with unmistakable recognition. Margaret felt her knees go weak as she realized that the Queen of England was walking directly toward their garden area, apparently seeking out Emma specifically. "Oh my goodness," she whispered under her breath, "oh my goodness gracious." Mrs. Johnson had completely forgotten about her camera and was simply staring with her mouth slightly open. The Queen approached the low barrier that separated their viewing area from the street and spoke in the clear, precise voice that Emma had heard countless times on television broadcasts. But now it was directed specifically at her, creating an intimate connection despite the public setting. "My dear," the Queen said, addressing Emma directly, "I hope you don't mind that I've come back. I wanted to tell you something important about what you shared with me." Emma felt her voice disappear completely, but for once it didn't matter. She nodded to show she was listening, her eyes wide with wonder at finding herself in direct conversation with the monarch. Margaret stepped slightly forward, placing a protective hand on Emma's shoulder while trying to process the surreal situation unfolding in their front garden. "I want you to know," the Queen continued, "that I understood your message completely. I learned sign language many years ago because my mother believed it was important to be able to communicate with all of her subjects, including those who are deaf or hard of hearing." This revelation sent a ripple of amazement through the small crowd that had gathered around their cottage. Emma felt her heart soar as she realized that her weeks of secret practice had indeed resulted in successful communication with the Queen. Her message had been received and understood exactly as she had hoped. The Queen's expression softened as she continued speaking directly to Emma. "Your message about finding strength after losing your parents touched my heart deeply. I lost my own father when I was quite young, and I understand how difficult it can be to navigate life when the people who were supposed to guide you are no longer there." Emma felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming emotion of being truly seen and understood by someone she had admired from a distance. The Queen's personal revelation about her own loss created an unexpected bridge between their very different lives. "I also want to tell you," the Queen said, "how impressed I am that you took the initiative to learn sign language on your own. That shows remarkable determination and creativity. You found a way to make your voice heard even when speaking felt difficult, and that is a skill that will serve you well throughout your life." Margaret was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the kindness the Queen was showing to her granddaughter and by the recognition of Emma's secret preparation for this moment. The neighbors stood in respectful silence, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary and deeply personal. The Queen reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. "I carry this with me to important events so I can remember the people I meet and the things they teach me," she explained to Emma. "I want to remember our conversation today, and I want to remember the message you shared with me." Emma watched in fascination as the Queen opened the notebook and wrote something in neat handwriting. She couldn't see exactly what was being written, but she could tell that the Queen was taking time and care to record something meaningful about their encounter. When she finished writing, the Queen closed the notebook and looked back at Emma with a warm smile. "You've reminded me today that there are many different ways to communicate what's important, and sometimes the most powerful messages come from the quietest voices." Then, to Emma's complete amazement, the Queen raised her hands and began to sign. Her movements were smooth and practiced, showing that she had indeed learned sign language properly rather than just memorizing a few basic phrases. Emma recognized the signs immediately. "Thank you for your courage and your kindness," the Queen signed, her hands moving with elegant precision. "You have made this day special for me, and I will remember your message always." Emma felt a surge of confidence that allowed her to overcome her usual public speaking challenges. She raised her own hands and signed back, "Thank you, Your Majesty, for stopping to see me. This is the most wonderful day of my life." The Queen smiled broadly at Emma's response, and then she did something that no one expected. She signed one more message, her hands moving slowly and clearly so that Emma could follow every gesture. "Keep using your voice in all the ways that work for you. The world needs to hear what you have to say." The small crowd that had gathered to witness this unprecedented royal stop burst into spontaneous applause as they recognized the beauty of the silent conversation taking place between the Queen and the 8-year-old girl. Even though most of them couldn't understand sign language, they could feel the emotional significance of what was happening. Chief Inspector Williams stepped forward respectfully to indicate that the security timeline required the Queen to return to her schedule, but Her Majesty held up one hand to request just a few more moments. She had one more thing she wanted to do before leaving. The Queen turned to Margaret and extended her hand in greeting. "You must be Emma's grandmother," she said warmly. "You should be very proud of her. She has clearly been raised with love and encouraged to find creative solutions to life's challenges." Margaret, still overwhelmed by the entire situation, managed to find her voice. "Your Majesty, we are so honored. Emma has been practicing something in secret for weeks, but I had no idea it was for this moment. She has given me a gift today," the Queen replied, "by reminding me that communication comes in many forms, and that the most meaningful messages often come from people who have to work hardest to share them." As the Queen prepared to return to her car, she signed one final message to Emma, "Remember this day when you need courage." Emma signed back, "I will never forget." The Queen returned to her vehicle, and the royal procession resumed its stately progress through the town. But everything had changed for Emma and everyone who had witnessed the extraordinary encounter. The little girl who had been worried about being voiceless in a crowd had not only found her voice but had used it to create a moment of profound connection with the monarch herself. As the royal car disappeared around the bend in the road, Emma stood in her grandmother's garden with tears of joy on her cheeks and a heart full of confidence she had never felt before. She had proven to herself that she had important things to say and creative ways to say them, and she had received royal acknowledgement that her voice in all its forms was valuable and worth hearing. Part 5 The news of Emma's extraordinary encounter with the Queen spread through Windsor with remarkable speed. By evening, reporters from local newspapers had gathered outside the Matthews cottage, hoping to interview the 8-year-old girl who had somehow prompted the Queen to make an unprecedented stop during a formal royal parade. Emma sat in the familiar comfort of her grandmother's sitting room, still wearing her navy blue dress from the morning's events, but now with a small gift box resting on her lap. The box had arrived by special courier just 2 hours after the parade ended, bearing the distinctive royal seal and addressed specifically to Miss Emma Matthews, the young lady with the beautiful sign language. Margaret fielded phone calls from journalists while trying to protect Emma from becoming overwhelmed by the sudden attention. The cottage that had been quiet and private for Emma's years of growing up was now the center of media interest that extended far beyond their small town. "Grandma," Emma said quietly, looking up from the unopened gift box, "do you think the Queen really meant what she said about my voice being important?" Margaret sat down beside her granddaughter and pulled her into a gentle hug. "Sweet girl, I think today proved that your voice is not only important but also quite powerful. Look what happened when you found the courage to use it." The gift box contained a handwritten letter from the Queen on official royal stationery, along with a small pin in the shape of hands forming the sign for courage. The letter was brief but deeply personal, thanking Emma again for her message and encouraging her to continue developing her communication skills in whatever forms worked best for her. But, more importantly, the letter contained an invitation. The Queen requested that Emma and Margaret visit Buckingham Palace the following month for a private tea, where Emma could meet other young people who had overcome communication challenges and found creative ways to express themselves. Mrs. Johnson knocked on the cottage door just as Emma was reading the royal letter for the third time. She carried a large manila envelope filled with photographs she had taken during the morning's events. "I thought you might like to have these," she explained to Margaret. "I managed to capture some beautiful pictures of Emma's conversation with the Queen. The photographs were remarkable. Mrs. Johnson had unknowingly documented the entire sign language exchange between Emma and Her Majesty, creating a visual record of what would become one of the most meaningful encounters of Emma's life. In the pictures, both Emma and the Queen looked focused and engaged, their hands moving through graceful gestures that told a story of connection across generations and social boundaries. One photograph in particular captured the moment when the Queen had signed her final message to Emma about remembering the day when she needed courage. Emma's face in the picture showed a mixture of wonder, pride, and determination that perfectly reflected how the encounter had changed her understanding of her own capabilities. Margaret carefully placed the photographs in Emma's memory box, alongside the royal letter and the special pin. These items would become treasured reminders of the day when Emma's weeks of secret preparation had resulted in recognition from the highest levels of British society. The story of Emma's sign language message to the Queen quickly spread beyond local news outlets. National newspapers picked up the story, and, by the end of the week, Emma had received letters from children across the United Kingdom who were inspired by her example of finding alternative ways to communicate when traditional methods felt challenging. One letter that particularly moved Emma came from a 10-year-old boy named James who had been born deaf and used sign language as his primary form of communication. "Thank you for showing everyone that sign language is beautiful and important," he wrote. "When I saw the pictures of you talking with the Queen, I felt proud of the way I communicate too." Emma's teacher, Mrs. Harrison, visited the cottage a few days after the royal encounter to discuss how Emma's experience might influence her approach to school presentations and class participation. Emma's confidence had transformed dramatically since her successful royal communication, and she was eager to explore new ways of expressing herself in academic settings. "I've been thinking," Emma told her teacher, "maybe I could teach some sign language to my classmates. Then, when I need to use my hands to communicate during presentations, they would understand what I'm saying instead of just watching me move my hands." Mrs. Harrison was enthusiastic about this idea, recognizing it as a creative solution that could benefit not only Emma but also her fellow students. The plan they developed involved Emma teaching basic sign language to her class once a week, gradually building a shared vocabulary that would allow for more inclusive communication during group activities. The cottage gradually returned to its normal quiet routine, but something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere. Emma's successful royal encounter had proven that the communication challenges she faced were not limitations but rather opportunities to develop unique strengths. Her selective muteness, which had once felt like a barrier, was now understood as part of a larger pattern of thoughtful, deliberate communication. Margaret noticed that Emma's overall confidence had increased dramatically since the parade day. She spoke more easily in situations that had previously rendered her speechless, and she approached new challenges with a sense of her own capability that hadn't existed before. The royal recognition had validated Emma's worth in a way that years of therapy and encouragement had not been able to achieve. 3 weeks after the parade, Emma received another surprise in the mail. The Royal National Institute for Deaf People had sent her an honorary membership certificate, along with information about their youth programs for children interested in sign language advocacy. The letter explained that the Queen had personally recommended Emma for this recognition, citing her example of using sign language to bridge communication gaps. Emma's story began to inspire other children who faced similar communication challenges. The local library where Emma had first discovered her sign language book reported a significant increase in requests for materials about alternative communication methods. Mrs. Henderson, the librarian, created a special display featuring Emma's story and resources for children interested in learning sign language. The most meaningful development, however, was Emma's growing friendship with other children who had been inspired by her example. A support group formed naturally around Emma's story, bringing together local families who were dealing with various communication challenges. Emma found herself in the unexpected role of peer mentor, helping younger children understand that there were many ways to make their voices heard. The invitation to tea at Buckingham Palace arrived with specific details about the event Emma would attend. She would be joining 12 other young people who had overcome various challenges to achieve recognition for their creative problem-solving skills. The Queen wanted to highlight examples of young people who had found innovative solutions to difficulties rather than being limited by them. As the date for the palace visit approached, Emma realized that her life had changed in ways she was still discovering. The selective muteness that had once made her feel isolated had become the catalyst for developing skills that allowed her to connect with people across traditional barriers. Her weeks of secret sign language practice had evolved into a broader understanding of communication as something far more flexible and creative than she had previously imagined. Margaret watched her granddaughter's transformation with deep pride and gratitude. The royal encounter had not only validated Emma's worth but had also demonstrated to the world that children who face challenges often develop extraordinary strengths in response. Emma's story had become proof that alternative approaches to common difficulties could lead to unique opportunities for connection and contribution. On the morning of their palace visit, Emma dressed carefully in her best outfit and pinned the royal courage symbol to her coat lapel. She carried her original sign language notebook, now a cherished reminder of where her journey had begun, with simple drawings and patient practice in front of her bedroom mirror. The palace tea exceeded even Emma's elevated expectations. She met young people who had overcome various challenges and found creative ways to contribute to their communities. There were children who had started businesses, kids who had invented helpful devices, and young people who had created art that communicated across cultural boundaries. Emma realized she was part of a larger community of problem solvers and innovators. When the Queen joined them for tea, she remembered Emma immediately and asked about her continued progress with sign language and her growing confidence in school settings. Emma was able to tell Her Majesty about the sign language classes she was teaching her schoolmates and the support group that had formed around her story. "I'm so pleased to hear about your continued growth," the Queen said to Emma during their conversation. "You've proven that challenges can become strengths when we approach them with creativity and determination. Your example is helping other children understand that their differences can be sources of unique contributions rather than limitations." As Emma and Margaret returned home from their palace visit, Emma reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning when she pressed her face against the cottage window to watch parade preparations. The little girl who had worried about being voiceless in crowds had not only found her voice but had also used it to inspire others to find theirs. The story that began with secret practice sessions in a small bedroom had evolved into a larger narrative about the power of determined preparation, creative problem solving, and the courage to communicate authentically. Emma had learned that voices come in many forms, and that the most important messages often require the most thoughtful preparation. Years later, Emma would become a certified sign language interpreter, helping to bridge communication gaps between hearing and deaf communities. She would often tell people that her career began with a secret notebook and a dream of communicating with the Queen, proving that ambitious goals combined with persistent practice could lead to extraordinary opportunities. But, on that original parade day, as 8-year-old Emma stood in her grandmother's garden with royal recognition fresh in her memory, she simply knew that she had found a way to make her voice heard exactly when it mattered most. The little girl's secret signal had not only stopped a royal parade but had also launched a lifetime of meaningful communication and service to others who needed to find their own unique ways of speaking to the world.